Hey, this is Rich, and this is my Theories of Personality lecture tonight. It's Erikson Part 2. And so to my theory students, if you haven't yet watched Erikson Part 1 on YouTube, you should do that first. We covered all of the basic assumptions of Erikson's theory in that previous video. And tonight, what we have left to talk about with Erikson is basically, I want to exemplify all of his 8 stages by focusing on one particular stage, which is the stage of adolescence, stage 5. As you know, there are 7 other stages, each relating to a particular time in one's life and a particular challenge that we're facing. But I'm just going to focus on Erikson stage 5. If you understand how this stage works, you can kind of extrapolate to understanding the other 7. So you know from last class, every one of Erikson's stages is framed in terms of a positive outcome versus the danger of a negative outcome. Stage 1, trust versus mistrust. And so on. So tonight we're going to be looking at adolescence, which in America is a long, extended period of time. And that is not universal. So let me frame this issue a little bit. Let's take a step back and look at the big picture. One of the things that's really good about Erikson's theory is it works well in cultures where people live relatively long lives, like the United States, like many parts of Western Europe. It doesn't work so well when you try to take Erikson's 8 stages of a full lifespan and condense them in a culture where life is short. So the whole idea of being an adolescent, of being a teenager, is culturally driven from the get-go. In parts of the world where people live long lives, we have the luxury of dedicating a number of years of living to this in-between place where in some ways you're still a child, but in other ways you're an adult and you're moving in that direction of adulthood. And America certainly is a good example of that. In parts of the world where life is short, where average lifespan may only be 55 years, you don't have the luxury of spending years kind of in the middle of the stream betwixt and between childhood and adulthood. So Erikson's theory works well in long-lived and fundamentally higher technology-based cultures. It doesn't work so well. In fact, it doesn't work very well at all when you try to take Erikson's 8 stages and bring them into a culture that's very different from American society. So imagine a culture where being 55 is like being 80 in the United States. In those sorts of short-lived cultures, when do you have to start making babies? As soon as you can, i.e. shortly after you go through puberty. But in America, with a longer lifespan, we can dedicate more and more years of living to this gradual transition from childhood through adolescence into adulthood. The other factor besides the lifespan is technology. Generally speaking, although this is a little too simplified, generally speaking, in cultures that are more technologically dependent, aka the United States, adolescence tends to be a longer sort of journey. Think about how many years it takes to develop certain technological competencies before you have a chance of functioning in a relatively independent way in young adulthood, aka early adulthood. In cultures that are less technologically dependent, adolescence tends to be shorter. So I guess what I'm trying to say, the takeaway here is do not assume that adolescence looks like it does in America as in other parts of the world. It can look very, very, very different. And even within America, would you agree that adolescence is longer today on average than it was 120, 150 years ago in Sussex County? It was, right? It was shorter back then. Many of the young women in theories who are traditionally aged students 150 years ago in Sussex County, by the time you were 21, 22 years old, it was very likely that you had children, and often more than one child. And while that certainly can still be the case today, the trends have changed. Now, in adolescence in general, think of adolescence as moving through different rites of passage. In cultures where life is short, here's how it could sometimes work. One day you're a child, then there's a ceremony called a rite of passage, spelled R-I-T-E, meaning ritual, not rite like R-I-G-H-T. And the moment that ceremony is done, then you are considered, in the eyes of that group, to be an adult, right? In America, it's hard for you and I to really get our heads around that. Now, we still have rites of passage, but they're watered down and they take place over a period of years. So in Judaism, a bar mitzvah or a bat mitzvah. In Christianity, a confirmation. Quinceañera. I love to say the word quinceañera. Just makes me feel happy. Quinceañera. Okay, move on, Rich. Turning 15. Sweet 16 parties. Getting your license when you turn 17. Certain rights that you get when you turn 18, and then even more when you turn 21. But notice that that's diffused over a period of years. There are cultures in the world where it doesn't work like that. Child, ceremony, adult. Okay, so what is Erikson's stage 5 about? It has a name. It is called identity versus role confusion. Again, the central task, according to Erikson, of being a teenager is that as you go through adolescence, you gradually figure out who you really are. If at the age of 20, 21, 22, 23, you're moving to young adulthood and you've succeeded at the main task of adolescence, which is to answer the question, who am I, right? Then you become a young adult who has some beginning sense of who they really are. If things don't go well during adolescence, the risk, the downside is you might move into young adulthood in your 20s, not with an established self-identity, but with what Erikson calls role confusion, where you really have no real sense of who you are in the world. Now, if you're 12, 13, 14, 15 years old and you experience role confusion, Erikson would actually see that as a good thing. You shouldn't think you have all the answers at the age of 14 in terms of your moral beliefs, your career ideals, the kinds of people socially that are good for you and the kinds of people to stay away from. Erikson viewed adolescence as a healthy time of experimenting so you can get some real answers to who you are. But it's one thing to be 12, 13, 14 and uncertain about who you are. That could actually be healthy. But would you agree with me that if you're 25 years old and you're in early adulthood and you're completely adrift, is that going to have some real life consequences for you, which are not going to be good? And the answer to that is clearly yes. So Erikson viewed adolescence as a time of what he called searching for true identity, searching for real identity. And that's going to involve, if you think about what does it take to figure out who you are you going to have to be willing to ask some questions and to do some exploring. And so to Erikson, adolescence is designed to be a time of self-exploration. So notice this idea. The same issue at one point in life could be very healthy, but at another point in life, that same issue could no longer be adaptive. It could become maladaptive. Okay, so to just kind of take a look at how this happens, Erikson distinguishes between what he calls a derived identity, which comes out of what we were told growing up as children, versus what he calls true self-identity. So let's look back before adolescence, right? When you and I were kids, early childhood, middle childhood, late childhood, puberty, and then very young adolescence, 14, 15. We hadn't lived long enough yet, and we didn't have the mental capacity to have a true identity, To quote the great philosopher Eminem, childhood is largely about, quote, I am who you say I am. Your parents, the adults who raised you, the kinds of experiences you had in kindergarten, 5th grade, 8th grade, the kids you hung out with, they all told you and me over and over who we were, right? So a derived identity simply means that our understanding of who we are has been derived by messages that we've taken in from the world around us. When you were 5 years old, no matter how smart you were as a 5-year-old kid, you did not have the cognitive tools to explore and examine your identity. Your mom and your dad, the world around you, constantly told you who you were. To Erikson, adolescence is the first time in our lives that we have the space, as well as the cognitive ability, to begin to search for our identity. And if one way to think about some amount of teenage rebellion, some parts of teenage rebellion are really simply teenagers, for the first time in their lives, no longer taking things in as blindly and naively as they did when they were children. Okay? So if you were raised in a Catholic family, that was part of your tradition and your family of origin. Very few kids at the age of 5 or 6 think, wow, there's hundreds of religions on the planet Earth. I wouldn't be Catholic if I had been born and raised in another part of the world. I wouldn't be me. I'd be somebody different. But when you become an adolescent and your knowledge base, your worldview expands, one of the things you realize is exactly that. Had you been born into a different family with different parents, had you been born into a different culture in another part of the world, you would be a different you. And I don't just mean religiously, I mean in every way that you can imagine. And so Erikson thought of adolescence as a kind of a first awakening. Now, the truth is, there are kids in America who are technically not teenagers yet, who are already doing some of this active searching and whose minds have already expanded. And could the reverse be true? Are there people well into adulthood who have never searched to try to figure out what they really believe and what they really think and what's right for them and what works for them? So you want to always take all of this discussion with many grains of salt. There are people who die at 80 who never actively search for their identity in adolescence or in adulthood. They just kind of took whatever clothes were put on them psychologically and said, well, I guess they fit well enough. I am who you say I am. And then there are people who may not have an identity crisis in adolescence, because many reasons that might not happen, and might actually have this kind of awakening in their 20s, 30s, or 40s, or even later. So it's not a universal experience. It is just that Erikson is suggesting that for many of us in America, adolescence is a time when we do a certain amount of searching to figure out what kinds of clothing psychologically really work well for us. Tanqueray, made to look like water. How's that pizza, by the way? Anybody want another slice? I know, it's pathetic. I'm doing the best I can. Anyway, in Erikson's view of adolescence, he divides adolescence down into earlier versus later. In earlier adolescence, Erikson argues that role confusion is a normal state of affairs. And as we go through early to mid to late adolescence, one of the things that he thought that we needed to do to develop an identity is to begin to search actively. And this concept of an active search is interesting. Now, active search for identity in adolescence, it doesn't have to be something that's always visible in public to other people. It can be very private. So let me ask you, how many of you in adolescence, kind of maybe in terms of your outer behavior, you conformed to the script, what was expected of you, but privately, inside your own head, you were doing some amount of searching. You were kind of asking questions as a 15-year-old that you weren't asking when you were a 10-year-old, right? Sometimes the search is public. Sometimes it's very obvious when you look at a 15, 16, 17-year-old that just publicly, they're questioning everything. They're really actively pushing back on the world around them, but it's not always public. And that's an important takeaway, because we sometimes tend to incorrectly assume that teenagers who are very, very rebellious in a public way, mom says yes, so you have to say no, are the ones who are actively searching for their identity. Not necessarily so. See, it's interesting to think about what real freedom is. If I have to always agree with you, I'm not free. But if I have to always disagree with you, I'm not free either. Both are dead ends. Real freedom is the freedom for me to take what you're saying or you're expressing and to work it through who I am, and then feel free to say yes, no, or maybe somewhere in between. So wildly rebellious teenagers are not necessarily having a true identity crisis in which they're actively searching for their identity. You can't really tell whether a teenager is going through an identity crisis. Sometimes you can't tell unless you really create a scenario where they're willing to share with you what's going on privately. You can look like a good boy or good girl on the outside and play along with the script, but still privately be searching for identity. So it's very common early in adolescence to experience role confusion, and you can use adolescence as a time of searching. Now, think about the different things that we have to try to get answers to in adolescence to be able to move into early adulthood with at least a foundation for who we are. One part, of course, is career. Right? Now, some of you in my class, you may have known since you were a little kid exactly what you were going to do career-wise, and that may not have evolved or changed. That can be. My son would be an example. My son Steve, from the age of maybe 5 or 6, he knew he was going to become a physicist. He had a clarity of focus on that, and that's exactly what he did. But for everyone like that, there's more of us that go through an evolution, often in adolescence. So I can't see you because you're not really there, but I know that if I asked you guys the question, how many of you, compared to when you were 16, have some very different ideas about where you're going career-wise at the age that you are now, 2021, whatever age you are? How many of you have changed your college major? How many of you have made changes in your career plan? Many of you in this room would raise your hand. And there's this interesting statistic that I've heard. I've never verified it, but I've heard it a number of times, may or may not be true, that when you start college, let's say at the age of 17 with a declared major, your first semester, somewhere around 70% of people will graduate with their BA degree 4 years later, having majored in something other than what they thought they were going to major in. So it's a time of change. It's a time of searching. And really, it's kind of ridiculous and unrealistic to expect a 17-year-old in America with all of these career options available to them to have a completely clear sense of what their journey is. So that's a piece of the search for identity, is where am I going to fit in the adult world in terms of career? But there's more than that. There's socially. So think about how many of you, when you look at like from 8th grade through your senior year in high school, had a certain group of friends who didn't change. They were friends from childhood, and they may still very much be, some of them may still be your friends now, but can look back and see that you kind of tried out, did a little bit of experimentation in terms of trying out some other groups of people. And almost like exploring who are the kinds of people I resonate with and who are the kinds of people I don't resonate so well with. That would be more, that's not a career exploration, but that's more of a social exploration. And then a third one that Erikson talks about is values, right? We grew up, mom and dad told us what was right, what was wrong, what was good, what was bad, what was moral, what was immoral. How many of you in adolescence have done some questioning in your own head and actively searched to see what kinds of moral beliefs and just beliefs in general work for you and what ones don't work for you, right? So um, there's the religious piece, there's the moral piece, there's the belief piece, there's career, there's interpersonal, where do I fit with other people? And there's more than that, right? Now, it's not a binary. Some of you may have known for sure as young teenagers that there were certain things you were raised with that absolutely are right for you. And other people may have searched and questioned everything. So it's not like one size fits all. Some teenagers do more searching, some teenagers do less searching. But I want to show you two different roads. One way to teach Erikson is to look at the two extremes, but remember, most of us were somewhere in between. Okay. One extreme journey from childhood to adulthood is what Erikson called a foreclosed adolescence. The word foreclosure. Now, when you hear the word foreclosure, what most of us think of is when you don't pay a mortgage and your house is foreclosed. He's obviously using that term in a somewhat different way. What he means by foreclosure is the teenager who never questions anything. They basically, when you look at their worldview at 13 and you look at them again when they're 23, 10 years later, whatever mommy and daddy, whatever their family of origin scripted them to think and be, that's who they are. And that's called a foreclosed adolescence, when basically you don't try on different psychological clothing to see what fits you. You take the way you got dressed, the way mommy and daddy dressed you when you were little psychologically, and you have this smooth adolescence. You don't rock the boat. You don't question. And parents, conservative parents will sometimes call these kids, they're such a good kid. And what do they mean by good is they don't challenge the parents. They don't challenge the parents' belief system. Erikson's research suggests that this is not a healthy thing, that it is better to do some amount of questioning and searching through adolescence rather than to simply take what's been handed to you. Because the danger with this is you then become a young adult who's living not your life, but somebody else's life, the life that was designed for you by other people. The opposite of foreclosure, the opposite journey, is called moratorium. And a moratorium, the word moratorium means, the definition of moratorium is to wait and buy some time before you make a decision, to explore your options and delay deciding who you are. In the moratorium adolescence, there is an active search for identity, while in strict, straight-up foreclosure, there is no active search for identity. So in moratorium, the moratorium kid is the one who is either publicly and or privately asking all kinds of questions. The moratorium kid might be the kid who says, even though I was raised Catholic, you know what, I'm not sure whether Catholicism or Judaism or whatever really fits who I am. Let me do some checking it out. They might want to go to different churches or synagogues. And they might, some might even say, you know what, Dad, Mom, at the age of 6, I'm not even sure if there's a God, right? Now, the way the parents respond to this is very important too, right? Some parents will kind of be rather cool with that and let the kids explore. And other parents will try to bring the hammer down, which almost always has negative consequences. But that's an example of moratorium, right? Having different friend groups as you go from a freshman in high school to a senior in high school, still having stable friends been in your life a long time, but checking out different kinds of people to see where you fit. That's an example of moratorium. So here's the two edges: foreclosure and Moratorium. And where were most of us? Most of us were somewhat blended. When I look at my own adolescence, I was blended. There were certain things I was raised with I did not question, but there were a lot of other things I did. So I would put myself kind of somewhat more toward Moratorium over that journey in adolescence. Other people might be more foreclosed. Now, this is going to shape the way you enter young adulthood. If you've been very foreclosed, you're going to enter young adulthood never having explored different options. And that might work for somebody, but it also frequently will not work well for somebody. You may have assumed that you were going to major in business from the time you were a kid because you grew up in a family